just put them in the chat, and we will discuss those at the end. So thank you so much for being here, Larry, and please share your screen and your talk, and we're anxious to hear it.
Okay.
And before you get started, let me just remind you that if you're not the speaker, please mute yourself.
There we go. Okay, well, thank you, Susie, and thank you, Jack. So my talk tonight is about how the Saguaro became the thing that you think about when you think about the American West. And by iconography, I mean strong defining images like this Harper's magazine cover from 1864. So these strong images and memorable associations like this sort of out of kilter paint by number window rock. The impressions that you've been accumulating in your head, you know, perhaps even since you were a little kid, and that you can add to anywhere, anytime, particularly now in our visual culture, in which we're steeped in events that aspire to a certain viral quality, like this recent New York holiday window that sort of neatly ties up in a single frame my interest in advertising history and the history of the American Southwest. But tonight I want to turn back the clock to where Saguaro iconography began, pretty much largely in the Gila River Valley. So our time frame begins with the botanical explorers of the mid-19th century and runs through the travel and tourism boosters of the mid to late 20th century, who pictured the saguaro as a welcoming symbol of fun in the sun, leisure, and recreation. So my method is really from the object or the photograph out. The talk is historical, but the method of selecting and choosing what to talk about is closer to art, or perhaps the building and the creation of an exhibit, which always begins with something interesting to look at and to think about. Or as one of my late museum friends used to say, kind of kicks your brain into gear. So with that said, let's go. My story begins with this particular magazine cover that I found in a used bookstore in Washington, D.C. And I have it here. And you can see it's kind of dog-eared, coffee stained. But I found this thing in a bookshop after I'd been, you know, through my MA program here in Tucson in the mid 70s, the 1970s. And so I ran across this thing and I was like, you know, it's completely in black and white. It's a kind of an annual survey of the state with some guest ranch advertising thrown in. And I know now that the photographer is Tucson's own Ray Manley, who was just then starting out in his young professional life as a guest ranch photographer. And it's a successful photo to me because I stopped and picked the magazine up. But on second thought, though, where are the spines? Like, what's going on with this? And the way that Manley frames his model literally in the arms of Saguaro is the heart of the matter. It's an interesting choice for a magazine cover. It's a stand-in for all of Arizona. And the way that he's composed this, it's hardly possible to get closer to the plant. So it's ironic that the root of the saguaro's success as a popular icon of the West lies in the mistaken assumptions that people have picked up over the years about where its native habitat actually is. Represented here, oops, where are we going? I can't advance. What is going on? There we go. It advanced. Represented here by these little smartphone type emojis, which have been doing all of the heavy lifting today for cactus iconography. And the map is by the artist Paul Maroka, based on recent information that was published a couple of years ago by David Yetman. But it's in the accumulation of other images that challenge, push out, and take liberties far from this habitat. To me, it's the imagined Southwest. It's up here in your head. Well, it's asking me to admit people and it's not letting me advance the screen. So I'm just going to admit this person and then I can advance. Okay. The Imagine Southwest up here in your head. Why isn't, I'm sorry, people, it's not letting me advance the screen.
Because you're a co-host, I think. I'm trying to watch, but I'm no longer seeing these admissions.
Really?
Yeah, this hasn't ever happened before, but
Well, let me get out of, let me get out of,
Let me hear.
there we go. It
Yeah, you
advanced.
should be able to advance.
Okay, just a hiccup, I guess. So this is the Imagine Southwest in your head that I've been trying to show you for the last 2 minutes. And for me, this is the kind of really interesting thing. It's a kind of a playful thing, this out of habitat, encroachment of the plant. But let's face it, the saguaros have had a lot of help, perhaps more than you can imagine. There's a long history of attempted transplantation of saguaros in California and exhibitions at railroad stations, mostly Southern Pacific stations from California to Texas. And then, of course, there are the world's fairs, all of which happened before saguaros enjoyed. I'm so sorry. Maybe if I pulled that, there we go. Before saguaros enjoyed the protection of light and glass conservatories. And this is the Phipps in Pittsburgh. And this is about 1903. Where cacti had to be indoors to protect them from the smoky city. But you could have seen them in hothouses from St. Louis to New York and England. And this one happens to be a private collection in Mercy in 1901. So what I'm going to talk about are the early influential published images dating to the plant's botanical discovery in the 1840s. Followed by public displays that created kind of uncertainty about the plant's habitat that sort of underlie its coming success as a Western symbol far and wide. And picturing Arizona, the saguaro pictures that the travel and tourism industry developed. And finally, the Tucson-based campaign of viral photographs that took liberties with the plants, circling back to that Ray Manley image, literally in the arms of saguaros. So first up, botanical discovery, published images. The first cactus specimens from the New World to be exhibited in the Old were in fact not saguaros, but rather large barrels. These were exported from the interior of Mexico through the port of Veracruz and exhibited at Kew Gardens in 1846. The exhibition of a Sirius senilis at Kew in 1847. Come on, baby. Please advance. Oh, please advance.
It seems
I'm gonna
like-
stop share and take this out of this full screen. Okay.
Yeah,
I
give
think-
that a try and we'll see if it pops back in.
Yeah,
Could be an
okay.
internet
I'm
connection
stopping
thing.
share. Okay, get out of that. Okay, this is just what it's going to come down to. There we go. Okay. A lot more messy, but maybe it'll be more expeditious. Okay, so you can see what's coming up and what's not. Okay, so here's the Sirius senilis that was exhibited at Kew in 1847, which anticipated the exhibit of columnar saguaro specimens in botanical gardens. This is the earliest sketch of the earliest surviving sketch of an armed and branched plant, and the sketch was made by Lieutenant William Hemsley Emery in 1848. And Emery was the head of the Army Reconnaissance Party charged with exploring the most flattest expeditious route to California from Kansas Territory in the era of the Mexican War. And it took him right through the Gila River Valley. And while Emery is known, a very well-known figure, having published a survey with the US Congress, the sketch that he made is hardly known at all, even among historians. And he's doing this from memory in a letter to his botanist friend, George Engelmann, asking Engelmann to please classify this plant with a botanical name for his survey. And so based on Emery's sketch and assorted cactus bits that Engelmann had around. He names it Sirius giganteus. And I won't linger on this too much longer, but if someone asked you to draw a saguaro, that sketch is pretty much what you might come up with. And if you happen to be reading along in his letter, Emery, he can't remember if it has spines or not. So the new name appeared with the published images in Emery's reconnaissance in 1848. And the lithograph presented the saguaro as a tree and was based on the drawing by an artist in Emery's party, Mr. John McStanley. And the drawing, it was supposed to go to Engelmann for identification and then to Washington to be printed. It went directly to the lithographer in Washington, skipping over Engelmann, hence Emery's letter and his little sketch. But it was from that sketch that, and other parts, that Engelmann names it Sirius giganteus. But what I like about these early images is it's kind of like a game of telephone. By the time you get to the finished published thing, you really have to wonder, like, what did it really start out looking like? Because they always introduce these figures, and the figures are sort of reduced, which lends the plant a more dramatic presence as a scientific discovery. But it didn't really matter at the time because not many people had seen these plants. The irony is that they keep doing it. This is a similar thing 10 years later in another Emery publication with a completely different set of lithographers and artists, and the figures seem to be getting smaller. A more realistic rendering of the fruit harvest appeared in this travel account published by the German explorer Julius Froebel, who traveled the Gila River Valley in the 1850s. A boundary survey party put into the field in 1850, led by the artist John Russell Bartlett, contributed this pen and ink wash. And in the waning days of Bartlett's tenure as the boundary survey head, which was eventually taken over by Emery, he and his party climbed the foothills of the Sentinel Peak area. And you can see the convento down in the valley there. There's the convento down there. But what I really enjoy about this are Emery's party, who are seen, relaxing in the company of plants, taking in the landscape. And so it's this social setting of people in the company of these plants that would become increasingly familiar to collectors, to health seekers, and boosters in the years to come. So now we have a black transition. In the 1880s, the production of saguaro pictures took an exponential leap when the railroad arrived at Tucson from California. So you probably know this, but the railroad does not come from the east to Tucson. It comes from the west to Tucson, and then it moves east. So as a consequence, saguaros soon make the return trip to California, where they're transplanted in gardens that in turn appear in pictures in the press. And the leading example of this is the Arizona garden at the Hotel Del Monte on the Monterey Peninsula. The hotel, which is basically a Southern Pacific Railroad hotel, opened in 1882. And this print appeared in Harper's in 1887. So it doesn't take very many years before these things start showing up on the Pacific coast of all places. So note that the plants are exclusively columnar. They haven't quite yet figured out how to move an armed or branched specimen. And also note the braces, the collars that they're sporting to hold them up and keep them in place. As you know, it's quite possible for a saguaro to cheat death and bloom for years in or out of the ground. And it was the Southern Pacific's demonstrated capacity or their ability to move saguaros from the Sonoran Desert led to displays at their passenger stations, this one at Los Angeles and this one at San Antonio. And ambiguity is being built a passenger and a postcard at a time about where the plant's habitat actually is. And these are placed along these well-traveled rail lines, highly visible. And it suggests how the saguaro began to become this kind of fixture in the popular imagination of a new, American West. But the sender of this card, for example, who apparently came from Ohio, wrote, "This is the picture of the depot at which I arrived in coming to San Antonio. And the cactus was brought here from New Mexico and is, as you can see, a giant." But the transplanted saguaros, they died in Texas, just as they eventually did in Monterey. And this colorized postcard pictures the Arizona garden on the peninsula at the height of their, at the height of the display, really. And note that the braces on the plants, they've been colorized. You can see there, little color. The successive pictures of the same area show the decline of the saguaro population, fewer, smaller, no braces. And finally, there are none. None. It retains the name of the Arizona garden, but there are no saguaros. And there are many more examples of the plants lingering in California that I could show you. But there really are no pictures to show, what no longer exists. And I hope that you can tell that this next one is a collage. It's a paste up. It's a tall tale postcard. It's a kind of a playful conceit. If you can read the headline down there, "Things grow large in California." And the appearance of such a card, I think, is significant because to get the joke, you have to be familiar with the plant already to know, for example, that the scale is playfully out of whack. And though the saguaros lingered before failing, their pictures remained in circulation for years, with people thinking that these things live in California now. But by the end of the 1880s, many individuals had taken up cactus collecting, some personally venturing into the field, while others traded in the simple pleasures of a small succulent garden or perhaps a pot on a windowsill. The Philadelphia nurseryman Albert Blank advertised cactus collecting as a hobby for all, offering Sirius giganteus, king of the cactus family, from 6 inches for $1.50 to 6 feet for $50. Excuse me. So 6 inches, $1.50, 6 feet, $50. The same year, in 1889, the Baltimore Cactus Society gets organized, and it holds what its leaders promote as the first cactus exhibition in America in 1893. And it's just novel enough to attract the attention of the press. Harper's rendered it as a social event surrounded by pictures of the giant cactus of the Gila River Valley. And the society published the first cactus journal in America, whose second issue featured a photograph of its outdoor display. Members lent plants for the summer and retrieved them in the fall. And the display was actually covered and uncovered to protect it from rain. In St. Louis, philanthropist Henry Shaw turned his private estate into a public garden. The garden continued after his death in 1898 as a leader in botanical research and Victorian display values. 2 columnar saguaros, I just love this, so I'm going to zoom in on it, flank the garden's gated portico in a formal arrangement worthy of Versailles. Shaw's outdoor displays occupied 150 garden laborers who moved the plants in and out of the safety of their winter hothouses. And you can see here, they're all potted, and the saguaros in back here, they're potted as well, and they just move them in and out of the greenhouses. Here's an example of one that's just arriving, and it's going to go through this door and be installed in the palm house. And when they break open the crate, it's sort of interesting to see the kind of brush that they use to pad and pack it out. So this is the first photograph that I know of a branched saguaro seen here, transplant. And this is, of all places, at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. And this is the seminal World's Fair you've all heard about, the White City of architect Daniel Burnham. And it was excavated near Tucson and transported to the fairgrounds courtesy of the Southern Pacific. The Tucson theater owner, William Reed, arranged for the collection of all manner of cacti to be sent to Chicago and planted around the fairgrounds. I have a couple of cyanotypes that are, I think, instructive here. This is in front, pulling out. This is in front of this building here. You just pull out, there's the building. And you can see they're mounted in a kind of a linear sand pile. And then on the corner is a saguaro, and it's got a couple of agaves at the bottom there. Now I'm going to pull back and show you stereo view of the same scene and that same corner with people looking at the plants. And it's always interesting to me to see people posed, looking at the plants. And meanwhile, over at the fair's territorial building, this is one shared by Arizona with New Mexico and Oklahoma. There's a collection of plants with a crested saguaro front. And while again, you can note the brace and wish that one had been available for this one leaning away from the building. Again, you see people posing with the plants, and this has got to be, for many, their first exposure to seeing these things. Again, which is one of the functions of the World's Fair, which is to present to you, the fairgoer, with the ultimate in display techniques. Okay, so you might think that the dissemination of pictures, beginning with survey reports, transplants, pictures and woodcuts and Harper's, postcards and stereo views, you would think that that would contribute to a kind of an upward trajectory in the curve of popularity in proportion to repeated exposure and knowledge gained about the plant. But you'd be wrong. It's a kind of an upward arc, to be sure, but it's not a smooth trajectory. At the Chicago World's Fair, a fair visitor from Arizona, for example, complained that the leaders of the territory had lost the opportunity to erect, quote unquote, a statue of abundance with a horn of plenty in each hand, instead of the withered and forbidding cactus stalk erected to indicate, we presume, the poverty of Arizona's soil. Just let that sink in for a minute. So don't think of that upward arc of awareness, being exposed to photos and these kinds of things is a smooth curve. Rather, it's more like a crescent-shaped sawtooth blade. It kind of goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it's going up, but it's kind of like a back and forth thing. I mean, whether the saguaro appears or not, all depends upon who's calling the shots. Like who's deciding for Arizona, what gets pictured, how it's pictured, which is to say, how the plant is framed and presented within and without the territory. So in the matter of dramatizing this particular vision and making it stick, with the turn of the century, any number of slides, transparencies, and stereo view cards picture the changes taking place in the territory under irrigation from crops to parks. So here's a stereo view of an alfalfa harvest. And there's no economic reason for the plants to be saved other than the cost of labor and the expense of a rather thorny and time-consuming removal. Cacti, large and small, figured as the casualties of irrigation when pictured at all. And this state of affairs did little to advance the image of the plant beyond its three-dimensional novelty in a stereo view. Up in Phoenix, the early set-aside of parkland, the Papago Saguaro National Monument, devolved from the wilderness it might have been. Postcards of the park's most popular geological formation, the Hole in the Rock, show the saguaro forest yielding to the irrigated features of a public park. And this is pretty much, like you see it today. So with the coming of the 20th century, you have a dip in the arc, but it never really goes down too far. And in fact, the way that I see it, the saguaro achieves parity, or at least a standoff, in terms of the territory's quasi-official imagery directed to the attention of would-be immigrants and investors, simply because the saguaro is here, it's there. as a regional identifier. So if you have, say, a picture of a prospector, a pickaxe, and a fir tree, to balance it out in a subdominant north-south arrangement, you have a rancher, a horse, and a saguaro. Now, this is, you might say, Larry, this is anecdotal evidence, and it is, to be sure. But those same tensions are exhibited in the design of Arizona's territorial seal, seen here on the left, and the state seal that was adopted on the eve of statehood in 1912. The territorial seal acknowledged the saguaro by tipping it in. You know, it's just, here we are, like the tall tale postcard. Only this time it's in the foothills of the San Francisco Peaks, north of Flagstaff, which is north of the Sonoran Desert. The state seal, which is unchanged and in use today, pictures a storage reservoir, irrigated fields, a miner with a pickaxe and a shovel, and a steer representing cattle. The state seal hardly settled the question of the saguaro's place by erasing it. And if you stand back and look at this for a minute, the irony is palpable. You have, you know, on the one hand, formal Arizona gardens that are in California as a statement that everything, all things grow in California, big things grow in California, while Arizona's state seal would have you believe that everything grows here except saguaros. So this state of affairs created a natural dilemma for Arizona's tourism industry, which was just starting to get off the ground. Now, to be fair, even in Tucson, there was a kind of ambivalence about the saguaro's place in promoting the city as a winter destination. In 1922, for example, the first pamphlets of the Sunshine Climate Club emphasized trees and lawns greet you on arrival. When the Chamber of Commerce published pamphlets to the outside world, shady streets and residential architecture that could have been anywhere was the norm, at least for now. This attitude persisted despite decades of desert study financed by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, D.C. In its publicity, the saguaro took a star turn, beginning with the construction of the building. Citing the new building among the plants was of great importance. And this has been a constant ever since. It's also consistent with the way that saguaro became the focus of publicity about the research that went on there. In 1902, the leaders of the New York Botanical Garden put an expedition into the field to collect what director Nathaniel Lord Britton described as interesting things for their new conservatory. Garden botanist Daniel Tremblay McDougall, who would later become the director of the Desert Laboratory, collected columnar saguaros and other succulents in southern Arizona and Mexico. Seen here are his crated specimens at Torres, Mexico in 1902. And McDougall returned to southern Arizona and Mexico the following year, 1903, to scout locations for the laboratory, underwritten by Garden board member Andrew Carnegie. So McDougall collected a second accession of plants, also created at Torres, but the shipment was damaged in transit to New York. Planted in pots and carefully braced, the columnar saguaros collected by McDougall from 1902 to 1903 bloomed for the camera, seen here at the Botanical Garden in 1905. George Engelmann's Sirius giganteus stood as the saguaro's botanical name for nearly 50 years until the garden's Britton and Smithsonian's Joseph Nelson Rose changed it to Carnegiea gigantea to honor the Desert Laboratory's patron, Carnegie. Carnegie, who apparently learned of the honor while visiting the laboratory at Tucson, was said to have been disappointed at his associates' pandering. So neither photographs nor press accounts documenting Carnegie's visit to Tucson can be found today. The name stuck, confirmed in publicity that leaked out about the name change in 1909, and in Britton and Rose's monumental work, De Cactaceae, botanical illustrator Mary Emily Eaton rendered the artwork for the color plates at the New York Botanical Garden. Now, this is the original art that Eaton rendered while in residence at the garden in 1912. And according to a light pencil annotation I'll show you up here. McDougall collected the saguaro in 1903, and this was the same trip in which he scouted desert laboratory locations. And just a second last close-up to show you Eaton's signature down there at the lower right. I want to shift now to the upbuilding of Southern Arizona's travel and tourism industry and the role its leaders played in overcoming or sidestepping entrenched interests of irrigation that continued to shape what Arizona looked like and talked about when it talked to the outside world. It was a long climb from alfalfa fields and orange groves to alternative pictures and photo publicity that celebrated native plants. This natural dilemma had long confounded the state's boosters, who ever since the 19-teens and 20s had made incidental use of the plant. But by the late 1940s, their literature had begun to move the saguaro from the margins to the center of the frame. When faced with a dilemma about whether or how to use native plants in their promotional materials, many institutions, from cities to passenger railroads, deployed the malleable arts of commercial illustration to reframe the destination. For example, you might put a saguaro on the cover of the back fold, as in this Mesa brochure, or you might boldly place it on the front and just be done with it. By 1950, even the Santa Fe Railroad, which runs through Flagstaff, has gotten into the act, rendering a saguaro using the railroad's signature New Mexico palette of purple shadows made familiar by its Grand Canyon and Indian Detour publicity. On this one, the saguaro straddles the fold of the brochure right down the center. So it was Arizona's guest ranches and their owners who softened up the saguaro as a welcoming symbol, a profound change from the days of territorial land sales, propaganda, and estate seal design that wrote off native plants. In their literature exemplified here, you can't get close enough. You're beginning to climb into it. The way the guest ranch owners picture it, the saguaro is a natural attraction that you relax with, you get cozy with, and cuddle up with, and you can even sleep with it. So guest ranch publicity is the spark of a social saguaro framed for creative leisure, relaxation, or my favorite, simple stare out the window contemplation. And there's quite a bit of this stare out the window stuff going on. The advertising agency partnership of Ernest Cabot and Norval Gill interpreted the saguaro as a freestanding artwork. They favored the frame technique in graphic designs for a long list of clients whose brochures folded the viewer's attention right back into the subject at hand. Their technique pictured an artist holding a framed saguaro at arm's length, comparing it to the full-size plant itself in a frame. The firm's artwork deployed window frames looking out on the desert to similar effect. For Tucson's Lazy K Bar Guest Ranch, Cabot Gill created brochures whose largest graphic element was the picture window in the ranch's lounge. Now, just follow the saguaro in this. As it changes over the years, you see the ranch's owners get older, they move the furniture around, they repaint the room, but the view out the window never changes. And this is the way that life is staged around the ranch and its promotion. Among enthusiasts of the compositional frame of cactus specimens and gardens, photographers Charles and Lillian Herbert built their Rudisill Road home with a picture window that looked out on a massive chandelier type saguaro. This was something that they not only lived with and could contemplate the Catalinas, but it was a prop whose outstretched arms became a welcoming metaphor that turned the desert into a living social stage for leisure, relaxation, and recreation. Described in perennial features as the view with a room, the Herbert's living room window framed the most carefully curated saguaro moment in all of Southern Arizona. And though citing a home with a window, a scenic view was not new, in the Herbert's understanding of what was important, the saguaro was the critical element. And over the years, the Herberts amortized the costs of their home's construction with illustrated articles about it, syndicating feature stories picturing the view as late as 1947. And here, this last one, I'll just show you how this was used as a stage setting. It says a story about visiting school teachers. And you can see here, just pulling back, it's the same window view. And Herbert sometimes used this plant in other ways too. He staged the creation of miniature dioramas in his backyard Ramada, where he posed the Guy Wellington Knopf family painting up these little Catalina mountain backdrops on concrete cardboard shells. Each were brought to life with tiny little clay saguaros. And the forced perspective of the road receding into the Catalinas rendered a pleasing facsimile of the Sonoran Desert. And again, going back to the anecdotal nature of what I'm presenting to you, by the time this company was finished, they'd made 80,000 of these little dioramas that they had sold around the world. So now we've arrived from the irrigated margins of the desert, and I want to talk a little bit about certain photographs with which you may be familiar, but of course there's a backstory. In 1922, Tucson Sunshine Climate Club was organized to fund a community advertising campaign to promote the city's winter climate. And ads were prepared by a Los Angeles advertising agency. It soon appeared in national magazines and newspapers. Each ad featured a coupon to clip and fill out. The coupon campaign was actually a clever way to compile the names and addresses of prospective Tucson visitors who might become new residents. The coupon offered a free booklet picturing the city and its surroundings, acknowledging its desert setting. The campaign was effective but expensive and was allowed to drop off in the Depression of the 1930s. In 1939, Sunshine Climate President Roy Drachman, seen here in his shiny rodeo parade shirt, and photographer Charles Herbert of window fame, set out to create viral photographs to promote Tucson in lieu of paid advertising. So the most well-known and widely reproduced photograph was the cactus bikini, or the cactus sunsuit, that appeared in some 300 newspapers across the nation and around the world, culminating a year later with a full-page story in Life magazine, for which Drachman and Herbert restaged the shoot that you see here. And though neither Herbert nor Drachman ever used the word viral, that was the intent, to create photographs that would find their way into newspapers and magazines without the expense of an ad agency. They called them gags. They didn't call them viral photographs, they called them gag photographs. Although Drachman and subsequent club leaders never dropped their ad agency, the gag photo publicity could run concurrently with advertising if and when the club chose to return to it, which it eventually did in 1950. But the effect of this particular gag photo, the cactus sunsuit, as attention-getting as it was off-putting. Touch me not. So the original gag of sawing and wearing plant parts soon led to less invasive poses. It was much easier, and again, this is that setting outside of Charles Herbert's window on Rudisill Road. It was much easier to pose models sitting in and on the plants or framed by the plants as if in a window. And so I'll just run through a couple of these here. Here's Ray Manley and an assistant, doing a fruit harvest shoot. And you can tell that the latter is padded. And the caption for the photo actually goes into some detail about explaining how these things are done and why they're called gag photos and that sort of thing. Here's another of a model, a high school model, barefoot. And this is most likely out at Saguaro East, although no one really knows for sure exactly where these were staged and shot. Popular enough and becoming familiar as a kind of a convention of travel and tourism publicity, the pose of being seated in a saguaro was applied to activities in other areas, even science. The visualization of end-of-life cactus care pictured the university botanist who had published theses on the so-called black spot disease, which, as you know, is just necrosis, as they daubed bleach solution on the plants while seated in their arms. And whether clipped or padded or tipped in, the saguaro became the lubricant of a distinctly modern Southwest into which anyone might climb. Ruth Egemeyer, the wife of the park superintendent at Saguaro National Monument, Saguaro East, posed as a park visitor for Arizona highways with a droop-armed saguaro, one of the oldest and most unusually formed specimens in the park. The photo of her leaning on the plant soon appeared in the cover of the park's 10-cent trail guide, inviting visitors, come here, come closer, come see this thing. The visiting school teachers, pictured in the Herbert's window feature, turned up at the National Monument and soon appeared on a postcard. Taking up the suggestion, the sender of this card, writing back to her mother in Iowa, asked, "Who has more fun than we do?" The tipping in of saguaros on a Tucson golf course, when I say tipping in, I mean they literally cut out a photo image and put it on another photo image. They're tipped in on a Tucson golf course, confirm the saguaro's arrival as a symbol of post-war leisure and recreation. This is a detail from a Sunshine Climate Club ad in 1950 when the club went back to national advertising. And it's set on the links of the Tucson Country Club. And the scene didn't exist. And we know this because the picture had to be explained in advance in the press to Tucsonans, including club members who may have wondered what was going on. Of course, the use of tipped-in photo elements to conjure up idealized settings was not new and was older than the cactus gag. But this, to me, this is a gag nonetheless. It's along the same lines. And this is what the course, I'll just have a shot of what the course actually looked like at a time. This is what they turned into a cactus-studded landscape. For the celebration of the golden anniversary of Arizona statehood and the territorial centennial in the year 62-63, the design of a commemorative seal embraced the saguaro front and center and was evenly divided with the Grand Canyon, inverting the usual north-south orientation. So here, in other words, they completely jettisoned the state seal. That is like nowhere to be seen in any of the outward publicity for the celebration of the centennial and the semi-centennial. And so what you get, I mean, and this is all designed mostly by the woman that designed the telephone directories for Mountain Bell created this seal. But the highway department, which was also the publisher of Arizona Highways, they came up with a commemorative, a golden anniversary saguaro, and a suggestion that if that one were needed, accompanied by gleaming chunks of gold on the ground. That's not copper, that's gold, and a suggestion, if one were needed, of the highly imaginative saguaro habitat that was unspooling along the nation's highways, or was going to. The largest specimen of its kind took root in Saugus, Massachusetts, on a hillside, a suburb of Boston, on Route 128, seen here in this undated photograph by the great roadside photographer John Margolis. And it seems the farther that you get from the saguaro's habitat, the more liberties that you can take with in modeling the plant. In this case, the outsized scale necessary to support a giant sign that you can read at a distance. And while we may never be able to plot a direct connection between the publicity of the celebration of the centennial and the kinds of things that you see on the roadside in the 60s, it's really kind of highly suggestive that this celebration actually had something to do with this. But what's not in question is the power of saguaro iconography to conjure up, to boil down, and distill a West into a single moment like this one. Now, the owners of a roadside motel or restaurant often appear in the postcards that they commission to give away as part of their advertising. And it's likely them seated outside contemplating their saguaro like a bunch of latter-day John Russell Bartletts in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. And it's likely that that's their Cadillac too. But meanwhile, back in Tucson, the social saguaro was heightened with horseback rides, cowboys, Western wear, covered wagons, barbecues, bathing suits, swimming pools, often in the same frame. And I said covered wagons, there's one right here. It's just kind of a sunshade chase lounge. I wish I could have made these larger for you, but again, I apologize. In Manley's oeuvre, there were two variations on the theme, the daytime horseback ride and the swimming pool party, and the nighttime campfire. This was for the Saddle and Surrey guest ranch's owners, seen here in their matching red shirts and white cowboy hats. Manley sharpened up the drama with strobe lights concealed between the rocks of the fire ring. The first renderings of the Sonoran Desert in line drawings, engravings, and woodcuts, first-person encounters with saguaros in gardens from the Pacific coast to the nation's world fairs, shaped ideas about Arizona and the arid Southwest. Growing an imaginative and far-flung commercial range with a robust tourist trade after the Second World War, the saguaro became an iconic presence that framed the desert for fun in the sun, social engagement, and leisurely recreation. At this point, completing the picture like the coupon required very little imagination. Saguaro iconography is nothing if not an expression of a human relationship with a plant. Looking back on pictures of people posed with the saguaro, we can see and imagine our most playful and curious selves. We express ourselves. We stop, take stock, and touch in the saguaro moment. Now, since I wrote those closing lines for the book, I've come to a fresher appreciation, or I've come to believe that it's actually the other way around. What's really going on in these pictures is the plants touch us. So thank you very much. I welcome any comment you care to make.
Thank you so much, Larry. Really appreciate you sticking with it. I know Zoom, as we're entering 2022, I would love to see us transition back to being in person. But it seems like it's still a ways away. And I will turn it over to Susie, who will facilitate questions. Feel free to continue adding questions to the chat. When we run through those, we will let people just kind of unmute and ask. So again, thank you so much, Larry. Really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was just so interesting. And I really enjoyed reading the book, and it was just exciting to see the pictures again and to hear you talking about it, Larry.
Thank you.
Let's see here. And I have a hard time. I'm not really good at multitasking. So talking and reading. Let's see here. But one of the questions, it says oops, it just moved. In early records of saguaros transplanted to exhibitions or botanical gardens, have you come across documentation of what sort of soil blend
No.
they used?
I've never seen that. I mean, but that doesn't mean that it's not there or that it doesn't exist. J.N. Rose's papers are at the Smithsonian, in the Smithsonian Library System. And I mean, it may be, I mean, I would start with somebody in the Department of Botany that has spent time, you know, with these legacy records. I mean, I would start with all of the classical gardens, Shaw's, New York Botanical. But I'm sorry, I don't have information about the soils. I just assume that they would have brought it enough with them. But I mean, you saw the way that they packed that one plant, though. It's just a plant out of water, you know.
Mm-hmm. But they did put the brush and things around it to protect
and in
it.
other
So-
pictures I've seen of some installations, you know, World's Fairs, it's a sand pile. They bring in sand, and that's, you know, But what the composition, what the mix is, I don't know.
if they thought it needed.
Thank you
And,
so much for taking that on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, do you know when the first transplanting started?
Well, as soon, as a historian, as soon as you say it started here, someone says, no, there was one the week before. But I believe that it's shortly after the railroad arrives here and it's coming, to Casa Grande down to Tucson. You've already scratched the outer edges of the Sonoran Desert, and things are being taken back to California, and they're trying to figure out what to do with them. I mean, and that's where this whole Arizona garden, comes into being at the Hotel Del Monte. And it's really among the men, and it's men, who are the officers in the Southern Pacific Railroad, who developed these gardens as a sort of unattainable, to the common person, exercise in conspicuous, consumption or transplantation or whatever you want to call it. Because once Chester Crocker had built the Del Monte garden, his partner, Leland Stanford, wanted one. So they made a Stanford garden at Stanford's home, which is now on the campus at Stanford. And then they maintain it, but there are no saguaros. They do it with agaves, prickly pears, opuntias.
And do you think that the simplicity of the saguaro shape and its ease of analogizing the plant to a person have impacted the appeal as a symbol?
Yeah, and you see this. Well, I mean, me personally, I always feel, that they're like waving at me. I mean, I just. But in terms of, but that doesn't go far when you're trying to write about, and build a case that there is a certain anthropomorphic quality about this. So you see that in other images that come out all the time. Like I think I showed an early image of the cactus ballet, where a model is mimicking the arms of a plant. And people have been doing this forever. And there are also many photographs of people who have climbed up into the plants, that are standing in the plants. They maybe have not made any plans to sit in the plants, but nevertheless, there's a ladder or evidence of how they get up there. And people just can't get close enough to this, which I think is one of the that was what kind of got me started with that magazine cover. I mean, I had been here and seen the plants, but I had never seen the way that they had been pictured, and like, where did this picture come from? But it totally gets into the anthropomorphic quality that people project onto them, touching, poking, hitting the spine, yeah.
And that actually brings us right to the next question, which is, do you know how they were able to sit on an arm? Did they pad the seat or cut off the spines?
Well, in terms of the what did I do with that magazine? In terms of the particular one that I was just talking about, I mean, you can tell when the plants get old, they do tend to lose spines, at the base of the plant. But I think what's happening here is they're just being loved to death with attention. Well, let's call it loads of attention. They've taken this picture before, and so spines, I don't have evidence where anybody says, well, we need to go out and we're going to cut the spines off this plant so we could sit in it. It's more like, okay, they're not going to tell anybody what they're doing, but they end up taking a board and posing a model sitting on a barrel, or they don't seem to have any hesitation of maybe cutting off a section of the barrel, to put the board on it, to sit on it, And in the book, there's this, to me, it's a hilarious picture of them posing a model in this elegant formal gown, seated in the middle of the Huntington's golden barrel collection. It's like literally, and you kind of wonder, is there another photo that shows the structure that's under that, what she's actually sitting on, you know? But the reason, Bill Stanton told, when he saw the picture, he told me that the Huntington had tried for years to cultivate saguaros and they couldn't do it. And so they fell back on the golden barrel that they sort of single-handedly rescued from, you know, oblivion, being trucked out of Mexico, and they began to cultivate them and they became known as the golden barrel. And so that makes sense why they would, you know, elevate them to that kind of a get up with a fashion model in a formal gown sitting. Just again, it goes back to this anthropomorphic, you know, quality of these things touch us, you know.
It's true. Well, thank you, Jack, for covering that. I lost my connection for a few minutes, but then
Oh,
I came
no worries,
back.
no worries. So the next question there was the painting you showed a few slides of, was that a watercolor, and did that artist illustrate other cacti species?
Well, Mary Emily Eaton is probably one of the most renowned botanical illustrators. And she had a residency at the New York Botanical Garden in 1912. And she painted, I don't know if she's the exclusive artist for Cactaceae, the Britton and Rose book, but she contributed, you know, tons of artworks and that are now the plates of record, you know, for that. But that is a watercolor. And there's a funny story that goes with that. You know, I wasn't expecting to publish anything other than that plate that you see all the time, you know, that color plate. And I called up my friends in the Smithsonian libraries and I said, I would just like a scan, or, you know, could you scan that image for me with they have a book scanner, you know, that kind of thing. And they said, well, wait, we're supposed to have the original art for that. And I was like, what? And then they said words that, you know, if you work in a museum or a library, you're never supposed to hear, which is, but we can't find it. You know, because they post, the Museum of Natural History, they post all of their art online, and it's not online. And they called me a couple of days later, they said, we found it. It was on someone's office wall, framed on someone's wall in their office. And so I had Alice Tangerini, their great botanical artist. She made the scan of that Mary Emily Eaton thing, and we put it on the back cover of the book. You know, so yeah, I love that. I love that image. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great one. And this is actually a fairly important question. In the early years of studying the saguaros and other cacti, did they ever talk to the native residents who have lived with the cacti for hundreds of years?
The record on that is quite mixed, and I would say it's pretty spotty. No, I would say no. And it's an interesting, you should talk to Ben Wilder about this. I mean, he is determined to write the history of the Tana Atom back into Tumamoc Hill, because when they began the Carnegie Institution, of course, and Daniel McDougall, William Cannon, they're charged with writing up and describing the significance of the hill. And they do it solely on botanical terms. They don't mention, but they do correspond back and forth about, you know, I found pot shards. I found, you know, petroglyphs. This seems to be the remnants of an Indian village on top of the peak. And it never goes anywhere. And in fact, when William Cannon, who's the first resident investigator who goes there, he begins to document the property with his camera. He finds a fruit harvest pole that was presumably left for the season, and he just launches it into the ground and uses it as a boundary corner marker and takes a picture. So there's very little interest. I mean, there is acknowledgement among people who travel through the desert, through the Gila River Valley, of the fruit harvest and the sustaining, qualities of this plant that's responsible for life, as it exists there. But one of the problems is, if you don't hit the fruit seed, if you don't hit that season, you might not even be aware of it, really, or that the plants flower at all. And for the longest time, that was one of the cases. I mean, Emery never pictures a flowering saguaro, ever. Although they eventually, get around to doing it. How can they not?
Right.
But yeah, but the business of discussing with Indians, and it happens by happenstance, by accident almost.
And I'll skip ahead of the next question, which I'll get back to. But Lynn commented that in the same vein, it's interesting that so few of the depictions show the plant in flower or fruit. It's always the vegetative shape that is being iconized. And then we have a question from Rex Graham. It's interesting that the photos don't show any woodpecker holes. Too messy, I guess. So kind of a question comment. And then from Barry, do you know if the hole is still at Papago Park? Presumably referring to the hole in the rock.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's still there. Of course it's there.
Cool.
Yeah, it's worth a visit. It's let me see. If you're going to the Desert Botanical Garden, it's not part of that complex. It's off on its own. I think it's closer to the zoo, but if you Google it, you can very easily find it. And there are people hanging out there all, hours of the day, all times. It's something you have to see, I think.
Cool. And that's great. That's all the questions we have. Again, if you did want to throw that book link into the chat,
Oh, okay.
that might be helpful. Just a reminder, this book is available for download or purchase, which again is just fantastic. And again, Larry, just thank you so much for your presentation this evening. I think we all saw some incredible photos, and it gets me really excited for hopefully a good saguaro bloom this year.
I hope so. Thank you, Jack and Susie and everyone. Thank you so much.
All right. And we will be back next month. Just look out for the e-blast that will come at you in a few weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Jack.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
Susie, thank you. Always appreciate you. I'll see you soon.
Okay, good meeting.
And Lynn, thanks for hopping in there.
Yeah, thank you for taking it on. I appreciate it. Good job, everybody. So
It's always something. All right, guys, have a great night.
yep.
Right now.
Bye-bye.